Alessio, it won't surprise you that the Australian worldview has two prisms, and they're set by our most important relationships, one with China, one with the United States, one by far our largest trading partner, one by far our most important ally. So I'd like to start by exploring your views on the current situation in the Indo-Pacific through that particular Sino-American prism. Could you give us a brief synopsis of what you think the current political and strategic situation?
First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. This is my first time actually in Melbourne, so I'm quite excited. I've been here before in Australia, but first time here. And you know, if you come from the UK, and particularly if you work in UK higher education, Australia is a natural sort of counterpart because the higher education systems are very similar, and in particular. When you are someone with my background working on Indo-Pacific, broadly speaking, Japan, particularly in maritime, then Melbourne becomes a natural sort of place to go because intellectually is home of universities with which we have very strong ties. And so I'm very pleased today to be here physically for the first time, in part because during the last 4.5 years, a lot of the work and projects were done because of COVID at distance. So I've been longing to be able to have an opportunity to come here for quite some time. And of course, this is a very important question to begin with, because it's a sort of a scene setting. And I think there's three sort of initial points perhaps to put out there. First of all, I think it is fair to point out, and I'm first and foremost a defense and security policy expert, so my thoughts, particularly this initial set of remarks, is coming from that angle in that sense. I will focus a little bit more about the sort of defense security dimension of this. And when we're talking about the Sino-American prism, certainly there is a significant change, and in a way, a sense of up until I would say 2022, there was generally a feeling that the relationship between the United States and China was becoming increasingly more competitive. There was an accent to it, sort of an accent on that competition aspect. But I think particularly when Admiral Davidson, the former commander in the PACOM, stepped down in his last remarks to engagement with Senate and over. You know, when the commander in the PACOM sort of steps down, he does a bit of an overview, you know, how sort of the strategy changed during your time in post and where things are going. And it was relatively significant that for the first time you have a senior military personnel coming from the single most important command post of this region, saying, well, we're looking at a situation of competition that might actually escalate into contestation, if not conflict, with giving a particular window, you know, what in Australia you would call a strategic warning time, in which for the first time you have command saying, well, as of 2027 onwards, you might find yourself in a situation whereby the risk of war is a potential reality. Now, of course, what he was saying was not that, you know, on 1st of June 2027, get ready because war is coming. That's not what he was saying. But it was still very strong. And I think it set the tone for where we are today, a situation in which that sense of urgency to have to talk about the deteriorating nature of the security landscape, particularly in that Sino-American competition space, has prompted a number of shifts, if you want. Because if you fast forward between 22 and 23, you have some of the most important partners and allies of the United States, first and foremost Japan, but also Australia, taking some significant steps in sort of changing their position and also making very clear that we're committing to significant reforms to enhance their defense postures, but also their political ability to work with the United States with the idea that if a crisis actually takes will be operationally capable to work with the United States. So perhaps the first point is that for the first time in a very long time, really, around 2022, you have a conversation that starts shifting towards a realization that risk of war exists, is in the region, and one needs to start thinking accordingly. The second point is a reaction that he has created within the closer allies and partners of the United States at the bilateral level. But then you have a third element, because this Sino-American, if you want, competition, or sharper competition, should I say, was sitting in the background of a generally deteriorating international security environment. Because in 2022, with the war in Ukraine, and then fast forward down to early stages of 2024 with the expansion of the conflicts in the Middle East, in Gaza, and the challenges to the stability of shipping lanes in the Red Sea, what you start seeing is that competition that seemed to be something like one of the big things and to be scared and worried about was this part of the world where it could happen between the United States and China. But I think what happens in the last couple of years is that we started to realize that, yes, you might have that sort of Sino-American competition at edge with, but that doesn't mean the rest of the world stops. And the other sources of crisis sort of stop existing. And that is important to keep on the back of our mind, because it is the correlation between what happens elsewhere in this part of the world that also has an impact on the direction of travel and the, whether and to what extent that competition between the United States and China continues to accelerate. And the case of the war in Ukraine is quite an important one, and because it prompted two significant conversations in the United States that are relevant to the security in this part of the world, and certainly how Europe looks at it. One, a sharper debate in the United States in an either or, right? Calling the Europeans to do more by themselves because of what is happening in Indo-Pacific, and therefore demanding stronger attention from the United States. And we've seen this with the debate around the support to Ukraine, and certainly a debate that might take even a sharper sense if there's a Trump administration Mark II coming about in 7 months after the elections. And the second dimension in which this deteriorating international crisis, sort of international landscape in security terms, has an impact is how it has made it clearer the links between this part of the world and the Euro-Atlantic. Whether it is North Korea supporting Russia through the delivery of ammunitions, or whether it is how microchips for Javelin missiles produced in Taiwan have an impact in Europe. The links have become clearer, and that will certainly have, and certainly is already having, an impact within how Europe looks at the Sino-American looming competition stroke contestation, but also how the United States relates to everybody else, and the importance for everybody else to pay attention to the fact that push comes to shove, that whether the United States will have to make a choice or not, it will be to keep their focus on the Indo-Pacific rather than elsewhere. So to begin with, that prism, I think, of the US-China dimension from a defense and security perspective, I think it has taken a very significant turn, a sharper turn, and a turn that with consequences, if you want, for all of us, not just in this part of the world, but also in Europe. So perhaps there's also an important element of this conversation. It's not just from an Australian perspective. Even if you argue that dynamic is not the only dynamic at work. There's all sorts of other challenges that are still out there that we need to deal with, whether it is climate change, whether it is maritime stability and looking after, fish stock degradation and whatever else. But in the context of that dynamic relationship, it is absolutely clear that how it is changing and how it is accelerated in terms of the sharpness of the contestation, as it were. It's something that has impact here, but it has had an impact also in other parts of the world, and certainly in Europe, and how Europe looks at this part of the world.
I mean, you mentioned the sharp debate of the either or, Europe versus Asia in the States. I mean, is there a realization that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, that actually war becomes more likely in?
I think this, it's a very good question. It's a tough question. Now, the good news is that this is a question that is very much front and center in capitals across Europe. Now, it doesn't make it any easier or it doesn't make it any better, but at least it creates a sense of awareness that possibility needs to be debated. We need to be ready to know, what we're going to do if something like that happens. Perhaps let's make 2 points about this. First of all, at the moment, the commitment is to prevent that reality from materializing to begin with. And that's the most important thing. Because it is creating in Europe dynamics of awakening towards the hard realities of international politics and the fact that you need to have a defense a posture that is capable of meeting those challenges. Now, that means also not just having the capabilities, the frontline capabilities, but rebuild also the industrial ecosystem that is necessary to support that frontline reality. That, I think, is the most important element of this story. Sort of lurking at our back concerning the possibility of a Russia that wins. The second thing to say is that there is a clear understanding that, of course, Ukraine is in the driving seat when it comes to theory of victory and how you draw the lines. Having said so, painful consciousness that how the conflict ends, and here ending, it's a relative word because it could be a ceasefire, it could be like a particular settlement, but will it last? So let's assume that we have some sort of an end which projects an idea that Russia had satisfaction to its original claim, broadly defined. That's a very terrible precedent. So specifically to the question about that increases the risk of war, well, it certainly does not decrease it. Because what it sends out some messages like, well, you can walk all over principles of international relations, most notably sovereignty, and you can get away, you can literally get away with murder in that sense. And so I think on the back of the mind that look at the current situation, hence why it is so important for Ukraine to continue to be able to push back, would send a particular type of message to many others. And in this part of the world, we know that coercion is already part of the sub-threshold way of communicating. So as projecting a statement to others that you get all over. Sorry. It's Russian interference operation.
Yeah, for sure. It is. Actually, I think that's what we're trying to use.
I'm told that they work together most of the time, so it could be either.
Which actually, of course, that conversation brings us neatly, of course, to Taiwan.
Yes.
Now, of course, here in Australia, we watch what's happening very closely around Taiwan. We watch the tracks of armed Chinese aircraft and ships getting out of place. We minutely examine signs of American commitment to Taiwan, strategically ambiguous or not. We follow Taiwanese elections, and we consider our own role in any potential conflict over Taiwan. Some will argue that tensions over Taiwan are not really the issue at all. The real issue is the Chinese challenge, which you implied, from the 2022 reference, the Chinese challenge to US hegemony in the region. And that war if it comes, come as a result of that challenge. Others argue, of course, that Xi's seemingly messianic duty to complete Mao's work by uniting Taiwan and China at last is actually the real issue. So I'm interested in your view. Do you consider that Taiwan could be the cause of potential great power conflict, or is it simply, or could it simply just be a catalyst for a war that's around the corner anyway?
So one of the challenges that, and then, you know, as an academic, since 2009, I've been going to China regularly and engaging with counterparts both in academia and the sort of PLA, broader sort of intellectual and engagement space. And one of the things that one could say is that one of the unseen and yet very real consequences of COVID was that for the better part of 4 years, you couldn't go to China. And therefore, you couldn't have the type of conversations that you used to have before that. And obviously, if you do meetings over Zoom, it's a completely different thing than being in the place, talking to people, and sort of having the formal setting, but also the informal setting where you can exchange views. Now, if you replicate that on a broader scale, that is true not only for intellectual and academic institutions, it's true for think tankers, it's true for government officials. So the first sort of observation to make about how to draw a distinction between the two and in terms of where Taiwan fits into the bigger picture. The truth of the matter is that we understand a lot less because in the meantime, we're all changed. And so is China. So we have a 4-year gap with a compound effect of things have changed in China. We haven't been able to sort of engage. And of course, the overarching sort of capacity for engagement has also changed in China because the instructions were to be much more careful in their engagement. So our capacity to read what is happening in China internally, I think, has been diminished at the end of COVID. And now we're starting to sort of have new opportunities to go back to China. I was back in China in November last year, and it's a very different environment, right? So that complicates our ability to begin with in terms of providing a satisfactory answer to your question. Having said so, I think the flip side of the coin is, does it matter to have an answer to the question in the sense that if I know that from a policy perspective, Taiwan is described by Xi Jinping and his own sort of policy documents and actions as a core component of the process of rejuvenation of the Chinese people that needs to be completed by 2049, I know one thing for sure. If it is hard for me to penetrate the black box that is this Chinese Communist Party internal mechanics, I can certainly, however, draw a reasonable sort of conclusions that if the vocabulary around Taiwan and the placing of Taiwan within the core documents of the party and in the hierarchical structure of those documents together, then I can certainly see that they are very serious about what they say on Taiwan. Therefore, a different way to sort of answer your question is, rather than focusing on whether Taiwan is a symptom or a cause, what I know is that there is an objective that is sort of like bringing Taiwan back home, as it were, by 2049. And what I also know is that that process is one that the Chinese, by their own sort of declarations, want to try to avoid being through the use of force, but they're not relinquishing the right to use force if there is no other means available. Now, I know that, once I know that, because the Chinese are very clear and everything in their behavior suggests that they are very serious about it, then the question becomes, well, they've got deadlines. I need to make time, my friends, right? If they have deadlines, I need to complicate how the deadlines, how they are formulated, come together, because if I cannot, if I cannot control their internal mechanism, what I can do, I can put them in the position that they need to change the current way of thinking, right? And make it harder for them to consider the military option, so as they'll have to come around and start thinking about this question of Taiwan within the process of reunification in different terms. Does that avoid the risk of war altogether? Certainly no, it doesn't, because at the same time, that sort of conversation has two components. One is where Taiwan fits into the process of national rejuvenation. But the other side of that conversation is to what extent the United States can come to lead with a China that will not change one particular element of its direction of travel, and that is wanted to regain it's, as the Chinese define it, their rightful place in international affairs. Now, we haven't got sort of in any recent history, and certainly in modern and contemporary history, two major powers that accommodate each other, as it were. And the question is, in that sense, to what extent the United States will be ready, willing to accept the relative and progressive rise of China, and to what extent that rise will come in a way that allows China to be socialized in an international system in which, regardless of whether you want to promote democracy or not, at the very least, you need to be able to respect core principles of international law, the so-called idea of a rule-based international order. We could negotiate what is the end state that can be acceptable to everybody, but what is certainly complex is that Chinese behavior at the moment undermines a basic understanding of rule-based order because it deploys a modality of advancing their own interests in which coercion is a frequent tool in the toolbox. So if you can change that, and if you can create an environment in which they have to start thinking differently about their objectives, maybe you can diffuse the risk of war and certainly push it further down the road. But can you eliminate that? Unfortunately not, because in this kind of context, agency does not belong just to one actor. And in that sense, is about sort of managing these differences of opinions and how you move forward.
So in terms of strategic complications to try and change the way that China perhaps views coercion and use of force, we have, of course, the strategic relationship between the US, India, Japan, and Australia. Yet there does appear to be more rhetoric than substance over the Quad. How important is the Quad for maintaining security in the Indo-Pacific? Is it a deterrent to China, or is it simply, as you mentioned, a strategic complication?
So I think the Quad is both a manifestation of and the result of the growing relevance and importance of minilateral formations, in addition to the traditional big multilateral toolboxes and the bilateral sort of mechanism. I think, particularly in a part of the world like this one, in which the security architecture is composed by overlapping elements, right? Minilateralism really is one of the novelties that has been taking sort of center stage in the past few years. AUKUS is a manifestation of that, and GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program, is another. What's the difference? Well, first of all, I think that the proliferation of these minilaterals is a good thing, because first of all, they inject resilience. You know, if people are busy meeting for all these things, they cannot do something else. And then it's not a joke. I mean, you know, in Southeast Asia, there is this most of the year is planned around all the various meetings that you hold and sort of against the ASEAN-led structure. So proliferation of minilaterals in this sense adds on top of what is already an existing logic of the security architecture, and they inject resilience. So I don't think they are a complication. They are part of a complex sort of architecture, and they inject resilience into it by their very existence. But you could say, okay, but what's the difference between the Quad and why does the Quad matter as opposed to an ASEAN-led? Now, let me use the paraphrase, something that our Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, said at the Munich Security Conference, which was in relation to the Red Sea, but I think it's relevant in this conversation. Different formations will address different type of issues, right? But at the same time, smaller multilaterals like the Quads, because they bring a smaller number of actors together, by their very nature, can allow you to be quicker on addressing the particular type of issues that they're coming together to address. So we know that post-COVID, for example, the Quad started to establish a number of working groups that were designed to deal, if nothing else, creating better coordination and cooperation on things like supply chains, preparation for health, disease, and then sort of major disruptions in that context. So in that sense, something like the Quad, it is very important because it allows for really important actors in the broader Indo-Pacific space, Japan, India, Australia, the United States, to have working level conversations about how to coordinate, if not cooperate, and in some cases one can cooperate, and that's why it's there, on issues that are of significant relevance. And that adds on top of the original layer that was the reason of the Quad to come into existence, which was cooperation at the tactical and operational level through military exercises to create a better mutual understanding. So Quad, from my perspective, certainly is not the type of multilateral that AUKUS or GCAP are, but it is nonetheless very important because it still is a relatively focused grouping that brings together like-minded actors insofar as some broader crucial issue of regional security are concerned. And so in that sense, it's a welcome addition. But at the same time, I would say it is important to accept that in a region like this, that is so big, it's so diverse, it's so vibrant and pulled in so many different directions, you will always have a variety of different multilaterals because that's the very origin of the security and political architecture of this space. So it's a very important place, but one in which we have to start learning to develop a vocabulary that captures the nuances and the differences of these multilaterals. See, what I find slightly uncomfortable is when sometimes you see media headlines placing, for example, the Quad and AUKUS in the same sentence. I don't think that is the right thing to do, but that doesn't mean that the Quad is not important or one is more important than the other.
So let's move on to AUKUS. So this will be the last question before opening up to the audience. AUKUS, of course, has caused deep debate here in Australia, probably more so than in the US and the UK. And it sparked a real conversation, I think, around two major issues, one political and one technological.
Yes.
The political issue is our relationship with the United States. We argue amongst ourselves whether our American alliance is vitally important to keeping peace in the region, or whether it might drag us into an unwanted, possibly nuclear conflict. We worry about the political direction of the USA and what that means for our long-term security relationships. And we worry about losing economic benefits of our exports to China. Political. The technology issue is twofold, I guess. One is very simple. Will manned nuclear submarines still be effective and survivable in the 30s and 40s? And will the promised Pillar 2 technology transfer ever be possible given US technology transfer rules? So I'd really welcome your views, based here in the UK, on AUKUS and what it means. Is it the most important strategic development in Australia since the Cold War? That's my view. Or is it a very expensive and possibly dangerous red herring?
It's an excellent question. So first of all, I wouldn't dare to come in here and define for Australia the extent to which AUKUS is or is not important. I wouldn't dare doing it. But first of all, I think you made a very important preliminary observation that is worth dwelling on for a minute, and that is AUKUS has taken a center stage place in the Australian national security debate for obvious reasons. And I want to reassure everyone in this room that the UK does not have the same center stage, but that does not mean that it's not equally important for the UK. And that the reason being that in the UK, AUKUS is part of a series of very important sort of developments, but not the only one. But the reason why it is important goes at the heart of your question, and in particular that sort of political and technological dimension. First of all, to what extent AUKUS sort of presents a dilemma in terms of entrapment versus reassurance. AUKUS, and that is certainly true for Australia as it is for the UK, is about reconceptualizing the notion of a national sovereign capability, in which, as a sovereign nation, one is making a conscious choice that the development of a critical set of capabilities will be done in conjunction with other partners. Politically, that's a statement, I think, of the value that one gives to partnerships, but it does not necessarily create an entrapment context, as in like you will be drawn into America's affairs. If nothing else, it creates a mutual dependency, which is natural in partnerships and strong relationships, that if nothing else, I would say it also increases the potential for partners like Australia and the UK, particularly when that is not just a bilateral relation. And here I wear my Japan expert hat for a second. When you are in a bilateral relation, your negotiating power is different than if you are in a trilateral relation. So AUKUS' advantage is that it is more than just the United States and Australia. And perhaps a part of the conversation in Australia should see the fact that it is a trilateral conversation and the trilateral sort of pact with the UK. It empowers the UK and Australia, both as sovereign national entities and together, to have more influence over the United States. And I'm saying here, I'm using the word influence with a small e, not a capital E. And so, sorry, a capital, a small I, not a capital one. So I would say, in the reassurance and entrapment sort of dimension of that political question, first and foremost, the capability in itself does not suggest that operationally you're tied to the United States, but B, more importantly, you should see also that as an opportunity to increase through this very critical capability, the ability to have an equal conversation, a very mature conversation with the United States and influence perhaps their political sort of behavior. To what extent the United States, though, the second point about elections in the United States and the reliability long-term of the United States, I would say none of us can actually speculate the extent to which, if there is a Trump 2 administration, how the Trump himself will affect the course of American politics and in particular foreign policy. However, if we take the first Trump administration as a template, at one level, I would say the period of the first Trump administration was the period during which countries like Japan and Australia stepped up to the plate to fill in part of the vacuum, right? CPTPP came together because of a joint sort of leadership role that both Japan and Australia injected into that conversation. To me, that is an important element, and something that suggests that even if the United States under a Trump administration, if there is another Trump administration, becomes a slightly more volatile and a mercurial type of actor. Well, last time that happened, actually, Australia and Japan, what happened was that those that are close to the United States, because of the institutional proximity with the United States, that deep network of connectivity that exists, were able to weather the storm, as it were. And in terms of economic loss, I think that I'm talking here, and I'm sure here, actually in Victoria, this might very well resonate. If you are coming from the UK higher education system, one of the questions that you have started to deal with in the last couple of years is we have a very high percentage of students, overseas students in our system. And tuition fees are a really important component of our income, particularly for the master's group. And in the last couple of years, we've all come to realize, some of us were arguing this earlier on, but certainly at the systemic level, higher education has started to realize that the assumption that the students' income coming from China that was going to go this way was a myth to begin with, and now it's certainly not a reality. And that sort of leads to a broader observation about the fact that perhaps the problem is not harming the economic ties with the Chinese, because I think good business will always be led by business cases. I think the problem is the assumption that you over-rely on a single source. And I think the case of Australia, which has suffered incredibly in terms of economic terms with the tensions that existed between Australia and China, you can certainly see that there was an attempt to address that by diversifying and increasing the resilience of the economic outlook by widening out the number of partners. So I think this fear that aggravating tensions with the United States translate automatically into an economic loss is built upon an assumption that I think is perhaps worth pushing back a little bit on, and that is, over-reliance on a single actor for economic benefit is never a good idea, right? And that applies to raw materials as well as higher education. So perhaps that is the space where we need to sort of look at. But on the tech side of things, and this is where the UK element that I mentioned at the beginning, why from a UK perspective, AUKUS is so critical. Because if we agree that modern prosperity is built on maritime connectivity intended as both a physical connectivity, shipping, and digital connectivity, which is first and foremost undersea cables, and you apply to that the extra sort of overlay of undersea critical infrastructure, which sits at the intersection of both, because it's both data flow but also energy flow, right? Then the maritime domain is and is likely to remain absolutely a central feature of the international order, right? And in the foreseeable future, which means that critical advanced capabilities that will empower state actors with a relative edge in that domain are also likely to remain extremely important. So within that context, if you're the UK, nuclear-powered submarines are not a question of whether if. That was a debate that was finished 50 years ago. You know that you made that choice, that's what you're going to have, and you're not coming back from that. But you also understand that in the future, they're likely to become an absolutely central component of your defense posture, right? However, so from a UK perspective, there is no question that there will be a next generation SSNs 15, 20 years down the road. But there is also a realization, and that's where the sort of AUKUS piece becomes like really central to the UK, because you have that certainty the maritime order is central to prosperity, and nuclear power subs are a critical component of the overarching defense posture that deliver an edge to protect that order, right? What you also realize is that developing nuclear-powered submarines is a particularly costly and a particularly demanding national endeavor. And given the current financial constraints on defense budgets, you can't really do it entirely by yourself. So in that sense, the sort of technological component of this is, in the UK, there is a clear consciousness that critical advanced capabilities will have to be built and developed together with partners. And that's part of that reconceptualization of a national sovereign capability. You know that from an operational point of view, it will be a sovereign capability, but from the perspective of building it, developing it, sustaining it, it's unlikely to remain just a pure national endeavor. It's going to be a whole of nation endeavor, but one that you will have to very likely pursue with other partners. And UK is becoming very much a poster child of this attitude, because we're doing the same thing with the Global Combat Air Program with Japan and Italy, right? This is maritime is got both maritime and air. Within that context, GCAP is coming from the same place, strategically speaking. And so I would say it's not about dependency. That dependency is inevitable. It is about how you translate that inevitable sort of need to work with your partners into an opportunity to maximize your investments and creating a defense ecosystem that is linked to the others, rewards your effort, and it does not deprive you operationally from the advantages of possessing the capability. But in terms of tech transfer, I think you are absolutely right. There is a challenge to overcome. And I don't think there is, of course, in the United States, there is a sense that perhaps Australia and the UK are not moving as fast as they should. But at the same time, in the United States, the debate over next generation nuclear powered capabilities is also one in which very often, if you are sitting in the UK or indeed here in Australia, you're left wondering why they're not talking about AUKUS as much as they should. And so I think that is a genuine concern, which in turn, however, I think, precisely because of point A, should keep our focus very much on ensuring that, in particular, the US Congress, which will have the last word on this, and those congressmen that look after constituencies that have a direct stake in the nuclear ecosystem, remain firmly on the ball on understanding why AUKUS matter, not just as a matter of strategic concerns and strategic significance, not just to the UK and Australia, but to the US as well. Because we all know from the last couple of months that the industrial capacity in the United States to meet their own requirement over nuclear power submarines is falling far short of where it should be. And so in that sense, there is a very winning argument in terms of technology transfer. That is, the faster you understand that is something that will bring you benefits in the United States, the quicker is going to be the dividends for everybody, and that technology transfer question addressed in a way that create the conditions from that win to come about.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Let's take some questions from the audience.
Okay, we've got a roving mic will come around. Please just state your name, and if you could keep it to a brief question, that'd be great.
Thanks, Alessio. Paul Monk. I used to work in defence intelligence, and now I'm a public intellectual. I wonder whether you're familiar with the argument by Hal Brands and Michael Beckley in the Danger Zone that the question is no longer will China just get stronger and stronger, richer and richer, and overwhelm us all, but will it in fact face a crisis within a decade with its population declining, its economy stagnating, the party entrenched and inflexible, and that for those very reasons, the hardheads in Beijing will say it's now or never, and therefore bring forward what at the moment is still a largely hypothetical crisis.
Do you want me to address this right away?
Yeah, go on.
So that's an excellent question. Now, I always point out that so I'm Neapolitan. I was born literally. My family lives under the Vesuvius. So if you're born under the Vesuvius, you know that life is relative. And the first thing I learned at school is that lots of your ancestors died, and the day before they didn't know they were going to die. So you can see that I come at this from a perspective that things happen. Having said so, I do think that David's own point about there's a window of time between 2027 and 2033, 35, where the risk of escalation that leads into open hostilities is higher than any time before and after, has merits. That doesn't mean that it will happen, but precisely because of the reasons that you mentioned, right now, we're looking at a situation whereby Xi Jinping seems to be very firmly convinced that one needs to stay front and center of this conversation over national rejuvenation. But you're absolutely right. The economy is not performing very well. Reforms are not coming about the way they should because of the entrenched nature of the party and how Xi Jinping has been removing systematically any opposition, which translates also in an inability to want to tell the boss, maybe this is not a good idea, right? So all of this has the risk of reinforcing internally a mechanism by which, if things get grimmer, and you know that the delta or advantage is getting shorter, than if you're faced with, okay, do we have patience and we'll wait, or not really, they might sort of be tempted by that. So yes, there is a risk there, absolutely. Having said so, that creates also a window of opportunity for everybody else around China, in the sense that if you know that they might end up thinking that in a phase of risk, you're probably going to go for it, what you really want to create is an environment around China in which waking up one morning and say like, yeah, let's go for it, is actually not the options you want to take. So that idea of deterrence and creating, which is done through alliances, through daily behavior, through communication, becomes an even more important question to address for us if we agree that a China that is not going like this, but is wobbling around, might actually lead to a potential greater risk of options of that kind to come about. So I completely agree with where you're coming from in terms of the question. I think it is a genuine concern, but I also think that that automatically translates into an opportunity to invest here and now with every action that we take into that deterrence picture. Hence, Pillar 2 becomes a really interesting sort of element of the AUKUS story, because if you look at it from a series of projects on stuff that is happening and you are accelerating, then you can use the political value of messaging unity that comes out of announcing steps and initiatives in that space, right? But it's only one component of that broader, complex, the conventional deterrence picture, which I think becomes absolutely essential, precisely in the context that you mentioned.
Thank you, Professor. John Fitzgerald's my name. I'm a retired professor of something or other some years ago. Chinese history.
Oh, lovely.
My question goes to this, the issue you just raised of deterrence or comprehensive deterrence in the region. I spent a few months in Taiwan last year. And at the time, the sense I came away with from Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese interlocutors was that what China sees as American hegemony is for them the post-war order. That the United States itself may not be committed, China's certainly not committed to maintaining that, but they are. And the concern then is what they can do among themselves, as you were suggesting, and this applies to Australia, to improve the capacity for deterrence in the absence of a US deterrent. It looks like a hopeless case, but in talking with a number of people, the impression I got that their lesson of the Ukraine war is a nuclear-armed power can invade a conventionally armed power with impunity. And it's widely known that Ukraine surrendered its nuclear weapons. And it was pointed out to me in a seminar, Taiwan did the same in the 1970s. when the United States uncovered and eliminated an effort to develop nuclear weapons in Taiwan. The ROK is talking about developing nuclear weapons. It's a public issue. It's not yet here. If in this, what's the risk of nuclear proliferation?
All right. So there's really two questions in your question. One is about nuclear proliferation, and another one is about what does nuclear deterrence, strategic deterrence in Ukraine tell us about Taiwan. Let me take the second one first. Ukraine does not have the same type of political and diplomatic arrangements with the United States than Taiwan has. Ukraine does not have any sort of arrangement in that sense, certainly one when the Russian invasion occurred with NATO, right? So the question about nuclear deterrence in the case of Ukraine and how it applies in the Indo-Pacific should be formulated not in direct reference to Ukraine, but rather, did nuclear deterrence work between NATO and Russia? From that perspective, I would say it has worked because notwithstanding the continuous sort of daily threats for a certain number of months from Putin that it would sort of unleash the nuclear tactical holocaust on NATO, that really didn't materialize, right? Systematically, NATO has sort of called that bluff. So I would say if we accept that Ukraine has very different arrangements in terms of diplomatic and political links to others from Taiwan, if we look from a NATO-Russia sort of perspective, nuclear deterrence actually works at the strategic level, which raises an interesting question in terms of like, well, how are the Taiwan? I was in Taiwan myself last summer, and I think in that sense, and that was about, when I was there, this was about the time that the nuclear debate in Europe and the role of nuclear weapons on strategic stability, as it were, between NATO and Russia, was becoming sort of much stronger. And I think it was interesting to see the Taiwanese reaction to that, because then for them, the question becomes, all right, so how does the Taiwan Act work? You know, what do we take the framework that we have with the United States in relation to that question? So that was an interesting sort of change. The other component, the answer to your question, is really about nuclear proliferation. I think the United States at the moment has been sort of behaving very consistently in ensuring that nuclear proliferation remains temptation rather than a reality. And I think the point you made about South Korea is a very good case. The renegotiation with the South Korean president and administration to ensure there is a visibility. And if you remember last year when the US SSN showed up in Korea, you know, that was very much about political messaging. Do you need an American nuclear submarine popping up outside Busan? No, because one of the key things about a nuclear submarine is that they can be a long way off and still have a strike capacity. But why did it show up in South Korea? To send a political message that the extended nuclear umbrella of the United States has the value that it always has. And I think in that sense, there is a sense of reassurance at the moment that insofar as nuclear proliferation is concerned, the United States are very clear that reassuring their partners and allies insofar as the extended nuclear deterrent continues to operate has been very strong. And I doubt that would change under the Trump administration. Potential Trump administration might be more transactional. I said, what are you going to give me in exchange of that? But I don't think it would fundamentally undermine that point. So at the moment, I think I remain relatively positive about the fact that strategic deterrence works because it has in Ukraine, and proliferation is in check because the United States over the last couple of years have been very, very busy in pointing out to the Chinese and Russians, as well as North Korea in that sense, that and their allies, reassure their allies that extended nuclear deterrence is there for them.
We've got an eye on the clock because we've got to get Alessio
Right.
to a dinner, but I'd like to we'll just come to Steph Lysett for one last question. Then in the room, maybe we can have a quick word before we go off, but we've got to try and send Steph.
So could I say first of all how much I'm enjoying your new facilities and new program and stuff? I think it's terrific. Been here 3 years and I think it's great what you're doing this year. And Alessio, we talk a lot down in Victoria in Australia, Northeast Asia. if and a little bit more about Southeast Asia and places like Second Thomas Reef, Scarborough Shoal, and if so, why do you think we might want to talk a little bit more about Southeast rather than Northeast Asia?
So, I mean, that's a very good question, and I think it strikes at the heart of the point I was trying to make earlier about the centrality of stability of the maritime order to the Indo-Pacific, but from the Indo-Pacific, then sort of the rest of the world, both in terms of how it prevents setting bad precedents, what is happening in Second Thomas Shoal is first and foremost a deteriorating sort of flashpoint, if you want, that is bad for the South China Sea and Southeast Asia, because it raises the risk of additional imbalance. So the steps that the Philippines are taking to bring back some measure of balance in their deteriorating sort of political and security signaling with China might create other effects within ASEAN, and certainly the relationship that the Philippines has with other Southeast Asian countries, not least the realities like Indonesia. But it also sets a really bad precedent in other parts of the world, right? Because if you are allowed to be seen as using coercion to advance my claims against yours, it's okay. That doesn't send a good signal, because there is a considerable amount of outstanding international disputes, both in terms of maritime boundary delimitations as well as sovereignty, territorial disputes. So from this point of view, Southeast Asia should be, and the South China Sea should always be in the minds of those who care about the stability of the maritime order, because their economic livelihood depends upon it. Last time I checked, Australia does depend on it. So in that sense, and it's not just an Australian question. It is also a question for anyone else in that same space, including the UK. In fact, I should point out that the only country that publicly, at least that we know of, to conduct a challenge of excessive maritime claims, for which the Americans have this terrible acronym FONOPS, which we don't use because we're a member of UNCLOS, and if you're a member of UNCLOS, you don't need to use a program for just sailing according to international law. But the UK is the only other country that has performed a challenge of excessive maritime claims in the South China Sea for the misapplication of straight baselines around the Paracel Islands. And no matter how you look at it, that principle is just inconsistent the way the Chinese apply around the Paracels. And in 2018, HMS Albion was the only surface combatant that we know of that specifically challenged that claim because of the inconsistency it has and why it sets a bad precedence in other places. So it is an important place to keep an eye on, and one in which there are steps that are taken, but steps that should be really very much central to debates in all those actors that care about the importance of the maritime order in terms of maintaining prosperity, connectivity, and international stability. The same way, perhaps, the Red Sea should be more on the radar of the larger sort of community for very similar reasons.
Alessio, it just leads me to thank you so much. I think you win the prize for the largest numbers of the greatest number of words and the most impressive number of ideas. I'll just ask the audience to join me in thanking you so much.